A reading from the book of You're good. Hear these words. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. And let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the we're just 3 short weeks away from the start of the NFL regular season. Gathering Sunday, sorry. Many of us are turning our attention to our beloved Broncos and raising our hopes that our 39-year-old quarterback will be able to once again run with perseverance the race that is set before him. And how timely it is that since we are turning our attention toward the sports arena, so is the preacher of Hebrews in today's text, as we see this shift of metaphor from the great chain of faith or cord of faith to running the race of faith with perseverance. We just last week heard the preacher of Hebrews recall the holy heroes in the spiritual hall of fame. Those faithful who from one generation to the next formed a kind of ring of honor that links us all from Noah and Abraham and Sarah to Moses and David and Samuel and the prophets to ultimately Jesus, whom the book of Hebrews calls the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. It is a great chain of faith, and it is a great chain of faith that is unbroken across time by those who have linked arms and joined hearts in this never-ending journey toward the heart of God, fully revealed in the face of Jesus, the one who anchors us in hope by the once-for-all sacrifice of himself, as the book of Hebrews has said throughout so far. And now the metaphor shifts, as I mentioned. It shifts just a little bit. And Hebrews 12 compares our journey of faith to that of a race that we run with perseverance and endurance our whole lives long. As Todd just mentioned, it is a long journey in the Christian faith. And we play our part in the great relay race of faith. We have been set up, Hebrews says, we've been set up for spiritual success by surrounding witnesses. Those who have taken their place in that great sports authority field in the sky and who are watching and waiting for us and cheering us on toward the finish line. And even more so, we learn the rules of the race by the one who teaches us how to run the race in the first place, Jesus. Anytime you have a theological question about Hebrews, you choose C. Jesus is the C multiple choice response. It's always Jesus, right? Jesus, the perfecter of our faith, who teaches us how to run the race, who has shown us to run the course with patience and perseverance and endurance and flawless form. He is the one who sets the pace and shows us how to dash and sprint when we have to in our lives, how to handle the long hills of grief and challenge and change when we must, how to slow down and take a rest when we are sucking wind in our lives, or when our faith becomes dehydrated and we suffer spiritual or emotional ACL injuries, or cramps of doubt, cramps of fear, cramps of shame. As we've learned through this experience of the congregation in Hebrews, the race is hard. Our muscles get sore for one reason or another. Our cardio capacity is not what we thought it was. And so we become tired. We lose heart. We lose confidence that we can finish the race we're running no matter how many pairs of running shoes we own or how long we've subscribed to Runner's World and no matter how many Cliff Bars we might eat, spiritually speaking. Translated, no matter how many years we've gone to church, no matter how many versions of the Bible that we own, and no matter how many times we have received communion, we all get tired. Perhaps this is the reason Hebrews gives this pep talk. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. I have to admit that this metaphor of running a race that Hebrews uses is a real stretch for me. I've never been much of a runner, though I've tried it in fits and starts to become one. But part of the point of Hebrews here is to show the congregation that no matter how much pain we may feel when it comes to the discipline of running or parenting or even faith itself, the payoff is what Hebrews calls the peaceful fruit of righteousness to all who have been trained by it. The peaceful fruit of righteousness. And isn't peace a quality worth having? All of us would probably say that we want more peace in our lives. And Hebrews is intent on them creating a culture and climate of peace by the way the people treat one another, and by the way they endure the suffering of hostility or public shame. Listen again to the text. Endure trials for the sake of discipline. God is treating you as children. For what child is there whom a parent does not discipline? Of course, we know enough by experience that being disciplined is one of those things we can all agree is worthwhile, but we don't always have the energy or focus or time to accept it. And this is the case with the physical discipline of exercise, Andrew, or eating as well as we should, Andrew. And the spiritual disciplines that we could all name, like prayer and meditation, forgiveness, gratitude, spiritual parenting, Sabbath rest, hospitality, just to name a few. And we just get tired and lose focus. I lose focus in spiritual parenting when my 6-year-old daughter asks me over and over and over if she can have dessert for breakfast, like ice cream. I take her to get ice cream. Mainly because she tells me, Daddy, I love you more than ice cream. Spiritual parenting is hard, you know. This is also difficult when we face hardships and resistance of all different kinds. Hardships and resistance that are more complicated than whether or not you decide to take your 6-year-old for ice cream. The people of Hebrews were facing similar struggles. We hear in today's text that they faced hostility that had not yet resulted in bloodshed. You know it's pretty bad when you're facing hostility, but you haven't shed blood yet. That's pretty serious. But they faced forces nonetheless that would keep them discouraged and tired, and that would make them throw up their hands and quit. But again, the preacher of Hebrews turns their attention to Jesus as the standard bearer of when this happens. He is the spiritual pace setter, and Hebrews knows it when he writes, Jesus endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Maybe the people of Hebrews are saying, I just want to run away from it all. I'm done with this. I'm too tired. I don't care anymore. This is too hard. There's too much danger. But as writer Samuel Shoemaker once wrote, as much as I want to run away from it all, a strange man on the cross won't let me. The wisdom of Hebrews, if I could summarize this psalm, is that there is an acceptance. There's an acceptance of hardship that is not admitting defeat. In fact, it's part of running the race and being surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses that are well acquainted with suffering, the world's and their own. The face at the finish line of our lives and our faith is the one we are pursuing all along, whether or not we know it. In the words of Mother Teresa, who used to say, Jesus is everyone in distressing disguise. Jesus is everyone in distressing disguise. And Christ comes to us the same way, in distressing disguise, in the stress and distress of the circumstances of our lives, within and without. I was reminded of this past week because GQ ran a profile of the great Stephen Colbert a few weeks ago titled The Late Great Stephen Colbert. And they checked in with the comedian, and according to the article, one of the country's few public moral intellectuals. He's going to be kicking off the Late Show in September to replace David Letterman, and so he's getting lots of press these days. But what struck me about the article was that it starts out with a story about Colbert needling rapper Eminem on a public access show in Michigan. But then taking this turn and saying all of a sudden, dropping things like, people's suffering is sacred. People's suffering is sacred. He was interviewed by Joel Lovell of This American Life, and perhaps his response has something to do with that interview. But I want to quote Colbert here because I think there are some things about suffering relative to Hebrews we can learn from what he says. He says this: I was left alone a lot after Dad and the boys died. And it was just me and Mom for a long time, he said. And by her example, I am not bitter. His father and some of his siblings were killed in a tragic plane crash. And so he learned from his mom. By her example, she was not bitter. Broken? Yes. Bitter? No. And maybe he said she had to be that for him. He has said this before, that even in those days of unremitting grief, she drew on her faith that the only way to not be swallowed by sorrow, to in fact recognize that sorrow is inseparable from our joy. And it is a way to always understand our suffering. It's a way to understand ourselves. And it's a way to understand suffering in light of eternity. Because what is suffering in the light of eternity? Imagine being a parent so filled with your own pain, and yet still being able to pass that on to your son. It was a very healthy reciprocal acceptance of suffering, he said, which does not mean being defeated by suffering, because acceptance is not defeat. Acceptance is just awareness. He smiled in anticipation of the callback, and he says, you got to learn to love the bomb. And boy, did I have a bomb when I was 10. That was quite an explosion. And this sounds strange, I know, but I learned to love it over time. And that's why. Maybe I don't really know the full reasons why. And that might be why you don't see me as someone angry and working out my demons on stage. It's that I love the thing that I most wish had not happened. The article goes on because the interviewer asked him if he could help him understand what he means by that, understand that better. And he described a letter from Tolkien in response to a priest who had questioned whether Tolkien's mythos was sufficiently doctrinaire, since it treated death not as a punishment for the sin of the fall, but as a gift. Tolkien says in a letter back, what punishments of God are not gifts? Colbert knocked his knuckles on the table. What punishments of God are not gifts, he said again. His eyes were filled with tears. So it would be ungrateful not to take everything with gratitude, he says. It doesn't mean you want it. But I can hold both of those ideas in my head and struggle to live it out. Colbert said he was 35 years old when he could finally feel the truth of all of this. And what gives us strength and energy to run this race, and not just start it, but finish it, is this sort of wisdom about endurance through suffering, perseverance through hardships, and knowing that all along we are not alone in our race of faith than we would be if we were running and running and running a marathon. New Testament scholar Tom Long provides a useful analogy. In many major cities, there are annual marathons involving thousands of runners. At the head of the pack are the world-class marathoners. That would not be me. Lean and speedy, they race through the course with astonishing swiftness. At the rear of the throng, however, the picture is quite different, because there we find ordinary runners. A few more years under the belt, perhaps. A little extra weight over the belt, perhaps. A lot more pausing to sip water and to catch one's breath. There are also the contestants on crutches and in wheelchairs, courageously out on the course nonetheless. Sometimes one of the runners near the back will grow weak from the heat or faint from exhaustion. When this happens, other runners will stop to help out, compassion being more important than competition in the rear of the marathon. So this is the face of what running the spiritual race is all about. In Calvary, you and I both know we're called, like the people of Hebrews, to do likewise. Lord knows that we are all small links in a much bigger chain of faith. But the face at the finish line really becomes the faces of all of us. If you look around, those in front, those in back, those beside you, we're called to be Christ to one another, after all. And that's what a community like ours is ultimately all about. In good times and bad, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, and especially in those times when we feel that we are one of the ones at the back of the pack. But if we don't give up, if we keep confidence and don't lose heart, we'll find the words of Jesus to be true all over again. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And so may it be for us, between the start line and the finish line. Back of the pack, leaning on each other, exhausted, thirsty, breathless, but leaning on each other. And if I'm going to stay in the race, I think you need to too. Let's stay in the race together.